The gymnasium echoed with the harsh laughter of 40 cadets who thought they'd seen everything the Navy could throw at them. They hadn't met Lieutenant Kira Volkov yet. She stood 5'4" in the doorway, her frame so slight that the oversized duffel bag slung over her shoulder seemed to dwarf her completely. Dark blonde hair pulled back in a regulation bun, face free of makeup, eyes the color of winter ice scanning the room with an expression that gave nothing away. The cadets saw what they wanted to see: a lost admin clerk, maybe a nutritionist, possibly someone's girlfriend who wandered into the wrong building. What they didn't see was the woman who'd spent 8 years in naval special warfare, the operator who'd earned her trident in a class where she was the only woman to complete Hell Week, the pilot who'd transitioned from ground operations to aviation with scores that made instructors check their equipment for malfunction. "Wrong building, sweetheart," called out a massive cadet named Briggs, his voice carrying that particular brand of condescension reserved for those who believe physical size equals capability. He approached with 2 others flanking him, their matching grins suggesting this was entertainment, not malice. "Flight trainings for qualified personnel. You looking for the administrative offices? They're in Building 6. Kira set down her bag with deliberate care, the kind of controlled movement that combat veterans recognize in each other, but that civilians and trainees invariably miss. "Building's correct," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent that hinted at grandparents who'd fled Soviet Russia. "Lieutenant Volkov, reporting as primary instructor for advanced tactical flight operations." The laughter that followed was instantaneous and cruel. Briggs reached for her arm, his hand large enough to wrap completely around her bicep. "Listen, whoever you are, this isn't funny. Instructors report to Commander Hayes first. We've got actual training. Remove your hand." The words came out flat, devoid of threat or emotion, which somehow made them more unsettling than if she'd shouted. Briggs squeezed slightly instead, a power play he'd probably used 100 times before. "Look, I'm trying to help you here. You clearly don't understand how things work." What happened next took less than 2 seconds. Kira's movement was so economical, so perfectly calibrated, that most of the cadets missed the specifics. Briggs found himself face down on the mat, his arm twisted in a joint lock that sent white-hot pain up to his shoulder, his cheek pressed against the worn canvas, while this woman who weighed maybe 120 soaking wet controlled him with what appeared to be minimal effort. She held him there, not applying additional pressure, just maintaining the lock with the casual competence of someone who'd done this particular movement thousands of times in situations where failure meant death rather than embarrassment. The gymnasium fell silent. 40 cadets who'd been laughing moments before now watched with varying expressions of shock, confusion, and the first dawning recognition that they'd made a catastrophic miscalculation. Kira's face remained expressionless, her breathing unchanged, her winter-ice eyes scanning the room as if cataloging every face for future reference. "Anyone else want to help me understand how things work?" she asked the question conversationally, as if she were inquiring about the weather rather than holding a 200-pound cadet immobilized on the floor. The silence stretched. "No, good. Then let me introduce myself properly. Lieutenant Kira Volkov, call sign Apex. 8 years naval special warfare, 5 years in the teams, specialized in direct action and counterterrorism. 3 years flying Seahawks in combat zones, where the enemy had surface-to-air missiles, and a healthy disrespect for international law. I've got more operational hours than most of your instructors combined, and I've done things I can't talk about in places I can't name with people whose tombstones list incorrect dates of death." She released Briggs smoothly, stepping back to give him space to rise. He scrambled up, face flushed crimson, cradling his arm while his eyes showed the peculiar mix of humiliation and grudging respect that comes from being comprehensively outclassed. The other cadets remained frozen, their certainty shattered, their assumptions revealed as the dangerous preconceptions they'd always been. "I'm here," Kira continued, retrieving her duffel bag, "because Commander Hayes requested me specifically. Because your class has the highest washout rate in the program's history. Because 22 cadets have quit or been removed in the past 6 months, and the brass wants to know why. They sent me to evaluate whether the problem is the cadets or the training methodology. She let that sink in for a moment. Based on what I've seen in the last 3 minutes, I'm developing some theories. A female cadet near the back, her name tag reading Martinez, found her voice first. "Ma'am, we weren't told we were getting a new instructor. We were expecting." "Lieutenant Commander Phillips," Kira finished. "He suffered a cardiac incident 2 days ago. He'll recover, but he's out for the next 8 weeks. I'm his replacement." She scanned the room again, and this time the cadets seemed to actually see her. Not the slight frame or the delicate features, but the scars on her knuckles, the way she stood with her weight balanced, the absolute confidence of someone who'd proven herself in environments where doubt killed. "I don't care what you expected. I don't care what you assumed. I care about one thing only, whether you can fly when everything's falling apart, when your instruments are lying, when your fuel's critical and your wingman's down, and the mission absolutely cannot fail. Because that's what combat aviation is. Not the textbooks, not the simulators. The moment when it's just you and your aircraft and a situation that wasn't covered in any manual." She walked toward the front of the gymnasium, cadets parting unconsciously to let her pass. "Flight line 0500 tomorrow, full gear. We're doing emergency procedures evaluation." She paused at the door. "And if anyone's thinking about requesting a transfer because their new instructor doesn't meet their expectations, save us both the paperwork. The Navy doesn't care about your comfort. It cares about your capability. Prove you belong here or prove you don't. But either way, prove it through performance, not prejudice." The door closed behind her with a soft click that somehow echoed louder than Briggs's earlier laughter. The gymnasium remained silent for a long moment before conversation exploded in urgent whispers. Martinez approached Briggs, who was still rubbing his shoulder. "You okay?" "My arm's going to be sore for a week," he admitted, his voice lacking its previous confidence. "But yeah, I'm okay." He looked at the door where Volkov had disappeared. "Did you see how fast she moved? I've trained with hand-to-hand combat specialists. That wasn't gym training, that was operational." Another cadet, Thompson, pulled out his phone. "Volkov, Kira Volkov." His fingers flew across the screen, searching for information that largely wouldn't exist, not publicly, not for someone with her background. What little he found made his eyes widen. Holy hell, she's not just a SEAL. She was part of Task Force Echo. That's the unit that doesn't officially exist. The one that operates in denied areas. "What's Task Force Echo?" someone asked. "You know that hostage rescue in Somalia 4 years ago? The one where 15 terrorists ended up dead and all 12 hostages walked out alive. The official story was Delta, but there were rumors. And that chemical weapons facility in Syria that mysteriously exploded right before ISIS could seize it. No attribution, no claims. Just suddenly, the entire compound turned into a crater." The cadets exchanged glances, their earlier certainty replaced by the uncomfortable realization that they'd grabbed, condescended to, and tried to physically remove someone who'd operated at levels they couldn't begin to imagine. Someone who'd proven herself in environments where their current training was considered basic preparation. Martinez voiced what several were thinking. Why would someone like that come here, to train cadets? She could write her own ticket anywhere. Briggs had the answer, or at least part of it. She said it herself. Commander Hayes requested her specifically. Something's wrong with this program, and they sent someone who doesn't care about politics or hurt feelings. He flexed his shoulder, wincing. They sent someone who measures everything by one standard. Can you do the job when it matters most? The question hung in the air as the cadets contemplated what 0500 would bring. Most had joined the program confident in their abilities, secure in the knowledge that their preliminary scores placed them among the elite. Now that security felt less certain. They'd been evaluated and found wanting before training even began, judged not by their test results but by their immediate assumptions, their casual cruelty disguised as helpful direction. "We need to be at the flight line in 9 hours," Thompson said finally. "And I don't think any of us want to give her more ammunition tomorrow." "Agreed," Martinez said. She looked around at her fellow cadets. "Whatever happens, we show up ready. We prove we belong through performance, not prejudice." She said that, and she's right. The gymnasium slowly emptied as cadets headed to their barracks, their earlier confidence replaced by apprehension, and in some cases, the first stirrings of genuine respect. They'd learned something crucial, though most wouldn't fully appreciate it until much later: that competence has no size requirement, that assumptions are the enemy of clarity, and that the most dangerous operators are often the ones you underestimate until it's far too late. Kira Volkov, meanwhile, stood in Commander Hayes's office reviewing the training records that documented the program's systematic failures. 22 washouts in 6 months wasn't normal attrition. It suggested something fundamentally broken, and her job was to identify the fracture point and fix it. She'd accepted this assignment for reasons that had nothing to do with instruction and everything to do with debt. Hayes had pulled her out of a situation in Afghanistan that should have ended her career if not her life. When he called asking for this favor, citing his heart condition and his concern for the program he'd built, she'd agreed without hesitation. But she hadn't expected the immediate disrespect, the casual dismissal, the assumption that her gender and size determined her capability. She'd faced it before. Of course, 8 years in naval special warfare meant 8 years of proving herself repeatedly to skeptics who believed women didn't belong in combat roles. She'd thought that particular battle was won, at least in principle if not always in practice. Apparently not. 0500 would be revealing. She designed an evaluation that would strip away pretense and expose the truth: who had the skills to continue, who had the potential but needed correction, and who was fundamentally unsuited for the demands of combat aviation. The cadets expected emergency procedures. They'd get those, but not in the sanitized environment of scheduled training. They'd get chaos, malfunction, and scenarios that required split-second decisions with incomplete information. She pulled up the personnel file of Cadet Briggs. Top marks in classroom instruction, excellent simulator performance, recommended by 3 different instructors. But his immediate physical intimidation of what he perceived as a vulnerable target suggested a fundamental character flaw that no amount of technical skill could compensate for. She made a note, then moved on to Martinez. Lower scores, harder struggle with the material, but the first to speak up, the first to shift from shock to engagement. That suggested resilience, adaptability, the capacity to learn from mistakes. By the time she finished reviewing all 40 files, the California sun had set over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson. Kira stood at the window, watching the light die, and thought about the 8 years she'd spent in naval special warfare, the operations that still haunted her sleep, the teammates who died doing the same job she'd somehow survived. She'd left ground operations not because she couldn't do the work anymore, but because the work had taken enough. Flying offered distance, altitude, perspective, both literal and metaphorical. But it also offered new ways to serve, new missions that mattered. If she could take these 40 cadets and forge even half of them into pilots who understood that combat aviation meant protecting people who couldn't protect themselves, who grasped that every mission had real stakes involving real lives, then maybe this detour would matter as much as the operations she'd conducted in places whose names remained classified. 0500 approached faster than the cadets wanted. They assembled on the flight line in the pre-dawn darkness, 40 souls in flight suits carrying gear bags, their breath visible in the cool morning air. Kira appeared precisely on time, her own flight suit worn and faded in a way that spoke of genuine operational use rather than cosmetic distressing. She carried a clipboard and wore a headset around her neck. "Morning," she said, her voice carrying without shouting. "Today we're evaluating your emergency response capabilities, not in simulators, not in controlled environments, in actual aircraft experiencing actual malfunctions. I've had our maintenance crew introduce various faults into 12 helicopters. Your job is to identify the problem, execute appropriate procedures, and make command decisions about whether to continue the flight or abort. You'll be working in pairs pilot and co-pilot, and you'll be evaluated not just on your technical response, but on your communication, your situational awareness, and your judgment under pressure. She began reading out assignments, pairing cadets based on her analysis of their files. Briggs got partnered with a quiet cadet named Park who'd scored perfectly on written exams but struggled with hands-on execution. Martinez got Thompson, a pairing that balanced Martinez's intuition with Thompson's technical precision. Each pair received their aircraft assignment and a sealed envelope containing their scenario briefing. One more thing, Kira said as the cadets prepared to head to their helicopters. Some of you will face scenarios with no good options, where every choice carries significant risk, and your job is to select the least bad alternative. This isn't a test of your ability to execute perfect procedures under controlled conditions. It's a test of your ability to make hard decisions with incomplete information while managing fear, stress, and the weight of responsibility. That's what combat aviation is. That's what I need to know you can handle. The cadets dispersed to their assigned aircraft. Kira moved to the observation tower where she could monitor all 12 helicopters simultaneously through video feeds and radio communications. Commander Hayes, looking pale but determined, joined her despite his medical restrictions. "You think this is too much?" he asked, watching the cadets conducting their pre-flight inspections. "If it's too much, they shouldn't be here," Kira replied. "I'd rather they wash out now than fail their first combat mission and kill their crew." She adjusted the radio panel, tuning into the first aircraft's internal communications. "Besides, we're not actually putting them in danger. The malfunctions are serious enough to require good decision-making, but not so severe they can't be handled by competent pilots. It's theater, but theater that teaches." Briggs and Park climbed into their helicopter, a Seahawk that had seen better days. They began their pre-flight checklist, their voices professional over the internal comms. Kira watched their body language through the video feed. Briggs confident to the point of arrogance, Park nervous but thorough. The malfunction she'd introduced would manifest 15 minutes into flight, after they'd relaxed slightly, after the initial tension of takeoff had faded into routine. "Actual emergency procedures evaluation," Hayes murmured. "You know this is going to generate complaints." "From cadets who fail," Kira kept her eyes on the monitors. "Good. They should complain about washing out. Shows they care. But if they complain about the methodology rather than their performance, that tells me everything I need to know about their suitability." The helicopters began spooling up, rotors cutting the dawn air, the distinctive thump of military aviation echoing across the flight line. Kira felt something settle in her chest, that familiar combination of anticipation and focus that had carried her through countless operations. This wasn't combat, but it was consequential. The decisions these cadets made today would shape the pilots they became tomorrow, would determine who stood beside her as instructors, and who returned to civilian life with stories about almost making it through the program. "Apex 1-1 Tower, you are cleared for departure," she said into her headset, beginning the sequence. "Tower Apex 1-1, Roger, departing north," Briggs responded, his voice steady. The helicopter lifted smoothly, climbing into the morning sky. Kira watched the altimeter feed, the engine readouts, the dozens of data points that told her exactly what the aircraft was doing. At 15 minutes, precisely as programmed, the number 2 hydraulic system would begin showing pressure fluctuations. Not a failure, not yet, but the warning signs that suggested potential catastrophic malfunction ahead. Briggs and Park would need to recognize the problem, determine its severity, decide whether to continue the training mission or abort back to base, and if they aborted, whether to declare an emergency or simply return as a precautionary measure. "Hydraulic pressure fluctuation, number 2 system," Park's voice came over the radio, nervous but controlled. showing intermittent drops not sustained yet. Probably a sensor issue, Briggs replied. We'll monitor it. Kira made a note, probably wasn't good enough. In combat, probably got people killed. She keyed her mic. Apex 1-1 Tower, confirm your status. Tower, we've got some hydraulic weirdness, but it's intermittent. Continuing mission. Your decision, Kira said neutrally. She didn't offer guidance, didn't suggest alternatives. This was their test, their choice, their future riding on the call they made in this moment. She watched the hydraulic pressure continue its programmed fluctuation, waiting to see how long Briggs would wait before recognizing that probably wasn't a sufficient risk assessment when you were responsible for a multi-million-dollar aircraft and a co-pilot's life. The morning stretched on. Some crews recognized their malfunctions immediately and made decisive calls. Martinez and Thompson faced an electrical system degradation and aborted within 3 minutes, declaring a precautionary emergency and bringing their helicopter down with textbook precision. Others struggled, hesitated, made poor choices that Kira corrected via radio before the situations escalated beyond the training scenario. Briggs, however, continued flying with deteriorating hydraulics for 25 minutes, his confidence overriding the mounting evidence that something was genuinely wrong. Park questioned him twice, suggesting they return to base, but Briggs dismissed the concerns. We're fine, he said. The gauges are probably acting up. Everything else is nominal. Kira let it continue until the malfunction entered its second phase, a partial failure that caused the helicopter to develop a slight vibration and reduced control response. Only then, with physical feedback making the problem undeniable, did Briggs finally key his radio. Tower, Apex 1-1, declaring an emergency. We've got hydraulic failure, returning to base. Copy emergency, Apex 1-1, Kira responded, her voice betraying nothing. She watched as Briggs fought the degraded controls, his earlier confidence replaced by visible tension. Park worked the emergency checklist, calling out procedures while Briggs struggled to maintain stable flight. They made it back, the landing rough but ultimately successful, and Kira waited at the flight line as they shut down. Briggs emerged from the helicopter looking shaken. I didn't think. The gauges didn't show. The gauges showed exactly what they showed, Kira interrupted. Intermittent pressure fluctuations indicating potential system degradation. Your co-pilot recommended return twice. You dismissed both recommendations based on your assessment that the problem was probably sensors. She stepped closer. In combat, Cadet Briggs, probably isn't sufficient. In combat, your reluctance to abort a mission killed your crew. The actual malfunction was a degraded hydraulic accumulator that would have failed completely in another 10 minutes, at which point you'd have lost all hydraulic control and crashed. But we made it back. Because I'm not actually trying to kill you, Kira said. Because this is training, not operations. But if this had been real, if you'd been over hostile territory with that attitude, you'd be dead. And worse, you'd have killed Park, who correctly identified the problem twice and got overruled by your ego. The words hit like physical blows. Briggs opened his mouth to defend himself, then closed it, recognizing the truth. What happens now? Now you decide if you can learn from this or if your pride matters more than your performance. Kira looked past him at the other cadets, who were gathering after completing their own scenarios. Flying isn't about never making mistakes. It's about recognizing them quickly, adapting immediately, and never letting ego override evidence. You have the technical skills, but technical skills without judgment are dangerous. She walked away, moving to debrief the other crews. Martinez and Thompson had performed flawlessly, their emergency response quick and decisive. Hayes would later tell her they represented exactly the kind of pilot the program needed to produce. Others had struggled with various aspects, some freezing under pressure, some making hasty decisions without gathering sufficient information, some simply lacking the fundamental skills despite their paperwork credentials. By midday, the evaluation was complete. Kira assembled all 40 cadets in the briefing room, the morning's experiences still fresh in everyone's minds. She stood at the front, clipboard in hand, winter-ice eyes scanning the room with the same flat assessment she'd used the previous evening. 22 cadets have washed out of this program in 6 months, she began without preamble. That's not normal attrition. That's systematic failure, and after this morning I understand why. She paused, letting them absorb that. This program has been selecting for confidence and technical aptitude, but confidence without judgment is arrogance, and technical aptitude without decision-making ability is worthless. Combat aviation requires something more: the capacity to make hard calls with limited information, to recognize when you're wrong and adapt immediately, to put mission success and crew safety ahead of your ego. She pulled up footage from the morning's exercises on the projection screen. Cadet Martinez, you and Thompson faced electrical degradation at 0715. You recognized the problem at 0716, conferred with your co-pilot at 0717, and declared a precautionary emergency at 0718. 3 minutes from malfunction to decisive action. That's the standard. The screen switched to show Briggs and Park's helicopter. Cadet Briggs, you faced hydraulic pressure fluctuations at 0830. Your co-pilot identified the problem immediately. You dismissed it. At 0840, Park recommended return to base. You refused. At 0855, Park recommended again. You refused again. At 0905, when the problem became impossible to ignore, you finally declared an emergency. 35 minutes from malfunction to action. In combat, you'd be dead. The room was silent. Briggs stared at his hands, face burning with shame and anger and the first stirrings of genuine understanding. Kira let the moment breathe before continuing. Here's what happens next. You have 48 hours to submit written analysis of your performance this morning. I want you to identify what you did right, what you did wrong, and most importantly, why you made the decisions you made. Not what you should have done, that's easy in hindsight. I want the actual thought process that led to your choices. She set down the clipboard. Because that thought process is what I'm evaluating. Technical skills can be taught. Judgment is harder, but it can be developed if you're willing to examine your assumptions honestly. A hand went up. Thompson. Ma'am, what if we got it right? Then explain why you got it right. What informed your decision-making? Because understanding why something worked is as important as understanding why something failed. Kira moved to the window, looking out at the flight line where the helicopters sat in neat rows. Every one of you has the basic skills to be here, but basic skills aren't enough. The pilots who survive combat are the ones who combine technical proficiency with sound judgment, who can recognize their limitations without letting fear paralyze them, who can be confident without being arrogant. That's what I'm looking for. That's what this program should be producing. She turned back to face them. Commander Hayes built this program to train the next generation of combat aviators, people who will fly missions that matter, who will protect ground forces who can't protect themselves, who will execute evacuations under fire and deliver supplies to units that are surrounded and provide close air support when the margin between success and failure is measured in seconds. That's not hyperbole. That's the job. And if you can't handle pressure in a controlled training environment, you certainly can't handle it when people are shooting at you, and your fuel gauge is dropping, and your instrument panel looks like a Christmas tree of warning lights. The briefing room remained silent as the cadets absorbed the day's lessons. Some looked determined, ready to prove they could meet the standard. Others appeared shaken, questioning whether they belonged. A few, like Briggs, showed the complicated mix of hurt pride and dawning recognition that comes from having your self-image confronted by uncomfortable reality. Dismissed, Kira said. Written analyses due 0800 Saturday morning. We'll review them in individual conferences, and based on those conferences and your morning performance, I'll make recommendations about who continues in the program. The cadets filed out slowly, their conversations muted. Martinez paused at the door. Ma'am, thank you. Kira raised an eyebrow. For what? For treating us like we matter, for caring enough to tell us the truth instead of just passing us through. Martinez glanced back at her fellow cadets. Some of them are going to wash out because of today, but the ones who make it will be better pilots because you didn't accept mediocrity. After Martinez left, Hayes approached from where he'd been observing silently. You're going to lose some good people with this approach. Cadets who might have developed the judgment you're looking for given more time and gentler feedback. Maybe, Kira agreed, but I'd rather lose them now than at their first combat mission, and the ones who stay will know exactly what standard they're being held to. She looked at Hayes, this man who'd saved her career and possibly her life, who'd built this program from nothing and now watched it struggle. What happened, Commander? Why the high washout rate? Hayes sighed, suddenly looking every one of his 58 years. The Navy changed the selection criteria 2 years ago, increased emphasis on test scores and simulator performance, decreased weight on psychological evaluation and leadership assessment. The theory was that technical skills were measurable and therefore more reliable predictors of success. The reality is we've been selecting for people who excel in controlled environments but struggle when things get messy. So we've been building pilots who fly perfectly until something goes wrong. Exactly. Hayes moved to the window, watching the flight line. And combat aviation is nothing but things going wrong. That's when you find out what someone's really made of, not when the checklist covers everything, but when the checklist is useless and you're making it up as you go. Kira thought about the operations she'd conducted, the missions where perfect planning met imperfect execution, where the enemy refused to cooperate with the tactical timeline, where success depended on adaptability and judgment rather than rigid procedure adherence. So change the selection criteria back. Not that simple. The change came from above, from people who don't fly but who make policy. Convincing them requires data, evidence, documentation that the current approach isn't working. You've got 22 washouts in 6 months. That's your evidence. That's a symptom. I need root cause analysis, recommendations, a concrete proposal for what should change and why. Hayes turned to face her. That's why I asked you here, Kira. Not just to evaluate the cadets, but to evaluate the program. Give me that analysis. Give me the ammunition I need to fight the bureaucracy. So that was the real mission. Not training 40 cadets, but rebuilding the selection and training pipeline that produced combat aviators. Not individual instruction, but systemic change. Kira felt the weight of it settle on her shoulders. The knowledge that her work here would affect not just these 40 people, but every cadet who came after them. Every mission those cadets would eventually fly. Every life they'd touch or fail to touch depending on whether she got this right. I'll need full access to the historical data. Selection criteria, evaluation metrics, washout rates going back 5 years. I need to see what changed and when and what the downstream effects have been. You'll have it by tomorrow morning. The next 48 hours were revealing. Kira read personnel files until the words blurred, analyzed performance data until patterns emerged, and most importantly, read the written analyses submitted by the cadets. Some were perfunctory, minimally compliant with the assignment requirements but clearly resentful of the exercise. Others were thoughtful, honest, showing genuine grappling with the morning's events and what they revealed about decision-making under pressure. Martinez's analysis was exceptional 5 pages of careful self-examination that acknowledged she'd been lucky to have Thompson as a co-pilot, that her quick decision to abort might have been too quick in a different scenario, that she needed to work on distinguishing between genuine emergencies and situations that could be managed through continued flight. It showed intellectual humility, the capacity to question her own judgment, the understanding that correct outcomes didn't automatically validate the process that produced them. Briggs's analysis arrived last, submitted at 07:59 Saturday morning, 10 minutes before deadline. It was 8 pages long, single-spaced and brutally honest. He documented his thought process minute by minute, the initial confidence that the gauges were malfunctioning, the dismissal of Park's concerns because he'd interpreted them as rookie nervousness rather than valid assessment, the gradual recognition that something was genuinely wrong followed by the ego-driven reluctance to admit error, and finally the fear that had gripped him when the helicopter's response degraded to the point where his technical skills barely sufficed to bring them home safely. "I was wrong," he wrote in conclusion, "not just about the hydraulics but about what flying means. I thought it was about being good enough that problems didn't become crises. Lieutenant Volkov showed me it's about recognizing problems early so they never become crises. I thought confidence meant believing in your judgment. She showed me confidence means trusting the evidence even when it contradicts your judgment. I'm not sure I belong here anymore, but if I do, it's because I can learn this. Not because I already know it." Kira sat in her temporary office reading that conclusion 3 times, remembering her own similar moment of recognition years ago in Coronado, when an instructor had stripped away her illusions about what naval special warfare demanded. She'd written something similar in her own post-training analysis, the acknowledgement that she'd arrived confident and competent and completely unprepared for the reality of what the work required. The individual conferences began Monday morning. Kira met with each cadet privately, discussing their written analysis and their morning performance. Some conversations lasted 5-minute straightforward assessments where the cadet's self-evaluation matched reality and the path forward was clear. Others stretched to 30 minutes or more, detailed explorations of decision-making under pressure, discussions of fear and confidence, and the difference between caution and cowardice. When Briggs entered her office, he moved differently than he had that first day in the gymnasium. Less swagger, more wariness, the physical manifestation of someone who discovered that his self-conception needed updating. He sat when she gestured to the chair, his posture correct but not relaxed. "Your analysis was honest," Kira said without preamble. "That's harder than most people realize. Genuine honesty with yourself about failure. Most people either excuse their mistakes or catastrophize them. You did neither. You explained what happened and why without self-deception or self-flagellation." "It didn't feel hard," Briggs said quietly. "It felt necessary. I endangered Park. I endangered the aircraft. I endangered the mission, because I was more worried about looking uncertain than about being wrong." That's a common failure mode among confident people. Confidence is valuable. Pilots who don't trust their skills make hesitant decisions that get people killed. But confidence has to be paired with intellectual humility, with the recognition that being good doesn't mean being right, that expertise is contextual and limited. She leaned back in her chair. "You asked if you belong here. My assessment is that you have the potential to become an excellent pilot if you can integrate what you learned. But potential isn't enough. Execution matters. What do I need to do?" "Continue in the program. Accept that you're going to be monitored more closely than cadets who didn't demonstrate the same judgment failure. Prove through sustained performance that you've genuinely internalized the lesson rather than just written a good paper about it." She paused. "And you'll be flying with Park as your permanent co-pilot. If you're going to endanger someone through poor judgment, it might as well be someone who's demonstrated the capacity to push back on your bad decisions." Something like relief crossed Briggs's face, followed immediately by determination. "I won't let you down." "Don't worry about letting me down. Worry about letting your crew down, about letting the people depending on you down. I'm just the instructor. They're the ones whose lives will ride on whether you learned this lesson or just pretended to learn it." The conferences continued through Tuesday. Martinez got high marks, and a caution about overcorrecting her quick abort had been correct for the scenario she faced. But Kira worried she might develop a tendency toward excessive caution that would limit her effectiveness in combat situations, where continuing despite malfunction was the better choice. Thompson received similar feedback about intellectual versus intuitive decision-making. His technical analysis was always correct, but sometimes the correct action needed to happen faster than analysis allowed. By Wednesday morning, Kira had completed her assessment. Of the 40 cadets, 8 received recommendations for immediate removal from the program. They demonstrated fundamental judgment failures that suggested they lacked the capacity for the kind of decision-making combat aviation required. Another 12 received conditional continuation, meaning they'd remain in the program, but face accelerated evaluation and potential removal if they didn't show rapid improvement. The remaining 20, including Martinez, Thompson, and Briggs, received unqualified continuation with specific development areas identified. She presented her findings to Commander Hayes in his office, the analysis backed by detailed documentation and specific examples. The selection criteria are producing technically proficient pilots who lack the judgment to deploy that proficiency effectively under pressure, she concluded. The fix isn't better training, though training can help. The fix is better selection. We need to reweight the criteria towards psychological resilience, demonstrated decision-making under ambiguity, and capacity for honest self-assessment. Hayes reviewed her documentation carefully, asking pointed questions, probing her reasoning. Finally, he looked up. This is going to be controversial. The people who push the current criteria won't appreciate being told their approach failed. Then they shouldn't have requested analysis from someone who doesn't care about politics. A slight smile crossed Hayes's face. Fair point. I'll take this up the chain. But Kira, I need you to stay on, not just for the evaluation but to implement the training methodology you're proposing, to show that this approach produces better outcomes. She'd expected this request, had been preparing her response since accepting the assignment. I'll stay through the current class cycle, 8 weeks, but then I'm done. I'm not a career instructor, Commander. I'm a pilot who's doing you a favor. 8 weeks gives me enough time to find your replacement and document your methods. Hayes extended his hand. Deal. The remaining weeks of training were intense. Kira implemented scenario-based evaluation throughout, replacing scheduled exercises with unpredictable emergencies that forced cadets to demonstrate adaptability rather than procedural memorization. She paired strong performers with struggling ones, creating teams where skills could transfer through direct cooperation rather than classroom instruction. She personally flew with each cadet multiple times, evaluating their performance under varying conditions: fatigue, stress, equipment malfunction, tactical complexity. The 8 recommended for removal fought the decision through official channels. Kira spent hours in review boards explaining her assessment, defending her methodology, providing evidence of their failures. 7 of the 8 were ultimately removed. The 8th, a cadet named Rogers who'd shown marginal judgment during the initial evaluation, requested one final chance. Kira agreed to a comprehensive reassessment: 24 hours of continuous training scenarios, designed to break concentration and reveal true decision-making capabilities under extreme fatigue. Rogers performed adequately but not exceptionally, demonstrating that her judgment under pressure was merely acceptable rather than dangerously flawed. Kira revised her recommendation to conditional continuation, earning herself criticism from some instructors who believed standards were being weakened. Standards aren't being weakened, she told them flatly. They're being clarified. We're not looking for perfection. We're looking for people who can handle imperfection without catastrophic failure. Week 6 brought external validation. The program's current graduates pilots who completed training under the previous methodology were compared to historical performance data. Their operational readiness scores were significantly lower than graduates from 4 years earlier, before the selection criteria changed. More concerning, their incident rates during operational training were nearly double what they'd been historically. The data confirmed what Kira's evaluation had suggested: technical proficiency, without judgment, produced pilots who struggled when reality deviated from textbooks. Martinez and Thompson emerged as natural leaders among the cadets, their strong initial performance earning them respect that they used to help struggling peers. Briggs, meanwhile, underwent a remarkable transformation. His flying remained technically proficient, but his decision-making improved dramatically. He learned to listen to Park's assessments, to question his own judgment when evidence suggested uncertainty, to prioritize safety and mission success over personal pride. By week 7, he was operating at a level that justified his continuation in the program. The final evaluation came in week 8, a comprehensive combat scenario that integrated everything the cadets had learned. They'd fly in teams of 4 helicopters, executing a simulated rescue mission in hostile territory with mechanical problems, communication failures, and tactical complications introduced throughout. No single helicopter would face insurmountable challenges, but the team would need to coordinate, adapt, and make collective decisions about how to complete the mission despite cascading failures. Kira watched from the observation tower as 40 cadets, now reduced to 32, launched into the California sky. Martinez commanded one flight of 4, Thompson another. Briggs flew as a wingman, his role supporting rather than leading, which suited his current development stage. The scenario began simply: transit to the objective area, locate the simulated downed pilot, execute pickup, return to base. Then the complications started. Martinez's lead helicopter developed fuel system problems that reduced her available flight time. She had to decide whether to abort and let her wingman continue alone or press on with degraded capability. She chose to continue, but repositioned her flight so her wingman could take lead if her fuel became critical. Good judgment, showing both determination and recognition of limitations. Thompson's flight encountered simulated ground fire that damaged his communication equipment. He couldn't coordinate directly with base or with Martinez's flight, forcing him to make decisions about the tactical situation with limited information. He chose to continue the mission, but increased altitude and adjusted approach vector to minimize exposure, demonstrating sound risk management. Briggs, flying as wingman in Martinez's flight, noticed that the simulated downed pilot's location had changed. The scenario parameters had updated mid-mission, simulating a pilot who'd evaded capture and moved to a secondary pickup point. He radioed Martinez immediately, providing the update and recommending flight path adjustment. Martinez acknowledged and adapted, completing the pickup despite her fuel concerns. The mission succeeded. Not perfectly. Thompson's communication loss meant some coordination failures that reduced overall efficiency. Not flawlessly. Martinez's fuel problem forced her to land immediately after reaching base, rather than conducting a normal approach pattern. But successfully, with all simulated personnel recovered, and all aircraft returned safely despite the cumulative challenges they'd faced. Kira debriefed them in the hangar afterward, the 32 cadets arranged before her, exhausted but visibly proud. "You completed the mission," she began. "That's the first thing to acknowledge, but completion isn't enough. We need to examine how you completed it, what worked, what didn't, and what that reveals about your readiness for operational flying." She walked them through the scenario minute by minute, praising smart decisions and questioning questionable ones. Martinez's choice to continue despite fuel problems earned qualified approval. It had worked, but the margin had been thin, raising questions about whether she'd taken appropriate risk or gotten lucky. Thompson's altitude adjustment was unequivocally correct, showing sound tactical judgment. Briggs's recognition of the changed pickup location demonstrated improved situational awareness and team communication. "Combat aviation is this," Kira said in conclusion, gesturing at the helicopters behind her. "Not the clean scenarios in textbooks, but the messy reality where multiple systems fail simultaneously, and the tactical situation evolves faster than you can update plans, and you're making decisions with partial information while managing fatigue and stress and fear. Some of you handled that well today. Others struggled but adapted. A few made mistakes that would have been serious in actual combat." She paused, letting that sink in. The cadets who demonstrated they can handle this complexity will graduate and move to operational training. Those who struggled will receive additional focused instruction in their weakness areas, and those who made critical mistakes. She didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone understood. The final graduation list came 2 days later. 28 cadets would continue to operational training. 4 would repeat portions of the advanced training cycle before being reconsidered. 0 would be immediately removed. Even the marginal performers had demonstrated sufficient baseline competence to justify continued development. It was both a success and a disappointment. Success because 28 capable pilots was significantly better than the historical average of 15 to 18 under the previous methodology. Disappointment because Kira had hoped to get all 32 through, had wanted to believe that every cadet who'd made it this far possessed the necessary capability. "You can't save everyone," Commander Hayes told her during their final meeting. "Some people aren't suited for this work, and that's not a moral judgment. It's a practical reality. You identified who could handle it and who couldn't, and you did it early enough that the ones who couldn't weren't put in positions where their limitations would kill people. Doesn't make it easier." "No," Hayes agreed, "but it makes it right." He handed her an envelope. "Your orders. You're released from this assignment effective tomorrow. Where are you heading?" Kira opened the envelope, scanning the contents. "Back to operational flying. Seahawks out of Norfolk supporting Atlantic operations." She looked up. "And you, how's the heart?" "Better. I'll be back full-time next month, implementing the changes you've recommended." He smiled slightly. "They're already calling it the Volkov Protocol. Your assessment methodology, your training scenarios, your selection criteria recommendations. You built something that'll outlast your time here." "Don't name it after me. I hate that." "Too late. The bureaucracy has spoken." His expression turned serious. "But genuinely, Kira, thank you. You came here as a favor to me, and you transformed the program. The pilots who graduate under this methodology will be better because of what you did." They shook hands, and Kira left the office feeling that familiar mix of satisfaction and melancholy that came with completing a mission. She'd fixed what needed fixing, had identified the fracture point in the training pipeline, and provided both diagnosis and treatment. Now it was time to return to operational flying, to the work she'd trained for and excelled at, and occasionally still feared. But before she left, there was one final task. She'd promised the graduating cadets a farewell briefing, a last piece of guidance before they scattered to their operational assignments. They assembled in the briefing room one last time, no longer raw trainees but not quite operational pilots, existing in that liminal space between training and reality. "You're not ready," Kira began, and saw confusion cross several faces. "That probably wasn't what you expected to hear at graduation, but it's the truth. You're not ready for everything combat aviation will throw at you. Nobody is. Readiness isn't about having faced every possible scenario. It's about having developed the judgment to handle scenarios you haven't faced." She moved to the front of the room, her winter-ice eyes scanning the cadets who'd survived her evaluation. "You've learned procedures, tactics, emergency responses. You've developed skills that will keep you alive when things go wrong. But the most important thing you've learned, or should have learned, is that confidence without humility kills. That being good doesn't mean being right. That the best pilots are the ones who can admit uncertainty, adapt to evidence, and make hard calls knowing they might be wrong but recognizing that no decision is often the worst decision." Martinez sat in the front row, her expression intent. Thompson beside her, taking notes even now. Briggs further back, his earlier arrogance replaced by something harder and more valuable: earned confidence based on demonstrated capability rather than assumed superiority. "Some of you entered this program thinking flying was about technical mastery," Kira continued. "You've learned it's about judgment. Some thought it was about individual performance. You've learned it's about team coordination. Some thought it was about never making mistakes. You've learned it's about recognizing mistakes quickly and adapting immediately. She paused, remembering her own graduation from Bud S., the ceremony where instructors who'd spent months trying to break her instead acknowledged her capability. The pride she'd felt, tinged with awareness that completing selection only meant she was minimally qualified to begin the actual work. These cadets deserve the same honest assessment. You've done something difficult, but the difficult part is just beginning. You're going to face situations I haven't prepared you for, she said. Emergencies we didn't simulate, tactical complications we didn't anticipate, moral dilemmas we didn't discuss. When that happens, remember what you learned here. Trust your training but question your assumptions. Listen to your crew but make decisive calls. Accept risk but don't court disaster. And most importantly, understand that your job isn't to be perfect. Your job is to bring your people home alive, while completing missions that matter. She looked at each of them in turn, these 32 souls who'd survived her evaluation, who'd been tested and found capable if not yet expert. Fly well, decide wisely, come home safe. That's all any instructor can ask of their students. The briefing room was silent for a long moment after she finished. Then Martinez stood, followed immediately by Thompson, then Briggs, then the rest of the cadets in a wave of motion until all 32 were on their feet in an impromptu gesture of respect that made Kira uncomfortably aware of the weight they'd placed on her assessment, her methodology, her judgment. "Thank you, ma'am," Martinez said simply, speaking for all of them. Kira nodded acknowledgement, not trusting her voice, and left the briefing room for the last time. Behind her, the cadets who would become the next generation of combat aviators remained standing, their futures unwritten, their capabilities proven but not yet fully tested, their understanding of what flying really meant forever shaped by 8 weeks with an instructor who demanded they prove themselves through performance rather than presumption. The California sun was setting as Kira drove away from the training facility, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson that reminded her of countless other sunsets in countless other locations where she'd completed missions and moved on to the next. This hadn't been combat, but it had been consequential. These cadets would fly missions that mattered, would protect people who needed protection, would make split-second decisions with lives hanging in the balance. And they'd do it slightly better, slightly wiser, slightly more capable of handling the messy reality of combat aviation, because of 8 weeks with an instructor who'd refused to accept anything less than genuine competence. Her phone buzzed with a text from Commander Hayes. "Safe travels, Apex. The program's in good hands because you showed us what good hands look like." She didn't respond immediately, instead watching the sun complete its descent below the Pacific horizon, the light fading into darkness the way every mission eventually faded into memory. Then she typed a brief reply. "Take care of them. They deserve instructors who give them truth instead of comfort." "They'll get it," Hayes responded. "That's your legacy." Legacy. Kira considered the word as she merged onto the highway heading north toward Norfolk, toward her next assignment, toward operational flying that would take her places where training methodology didn't matter as much as execution under fire. She'd never thought much about legacy, had always focused on the immediate mission rather than long-term impact. But maybe Hayes was right. Maybe the most important thing she'd done wasn't the operations in denied areas or the tactical missions, or the years of proving herself in environments designed to break her. Maybe it was these 8 weeks teaching 40 cadets that competence required judgment, that confidence required humility, that excellence demanded honest self-assessment. The highway stretched ahead into darkness, mile markers counting down distance to her next chapter. Behind her, the training facility disappeared in the rearview mirror, its lights twinkling in the California night. Somewhere in those buildings, 32 cadets who'd arrived confident and departed competent were preparing for operational assignments that would test everything they'd learned. Some would excel, some would struggle. All would carry with them the lessons of 8 weeks when their assumptions were challenged, their capabilities tested, and their understanding of what flying really meant fundamentally reshaped. Kira Volkov, call sign Apex, drove into the darkness thinking about the next mission, the next challenge, the next opportunity to prove that competence transcended assumptions and that excellence required only capability, not compliance with others' limited expectations. 8 years in naval special warfare had taught her that lesson repeatedly. 8 weeks training cadets had let her teach it to others. And whatever came next would continue that education, that endless process of demonstrating through performance what too many people still struggled to believe: that capability had no size requirement, no gender limitation, no predetermined form. Only results mattered. Only execution counted. Only the mission separated those who belonged from those who didn't. The highway stretched on, carrying her toward Norfolk, toward operational flying, toward the next chapter in a career defined by proving competence when others assumed incompetence, by demonstrating capability when others expected failure, by executing missions when others thought she'd break under pressure. She'd done it in naval special warfare. She'd done it as a combat pilot. She'd done it as an instructor transforming a failing training program. And she'd keep doing it for as long as the Navy needed pilots who understood that combat aviation meant flying when everything was falling apart, deciding when information was incomplete, succeeding when failure seemed inevitable. The darkness swallowed the highway ahead, but Kira drove confidently into it, her hands steady on the wheel, her mind already moving past this completed mission toward the next challenge, the next test, the next opportunity to demonstrate what she'd spent 8 years proving: that excellence required only competence and determination, that capability transcended expectation, and that the best pilots were those who'd learned through hard experience that survival meant adapting faster than circumstances evolved, deciding more wisely than panic suggested, and flying better than fear allowed. Behind her, 32 cadets slept in their barracks, dreaming of operational assignments and future missions, and the moment when training would become reality. They'd carry Lieutenant Kira Volkov's lessons forward, the understanding that confidence required humility, that judgment mattered more than procedures, that honest self-assessment distinguished exceptional pilots from merely adequate ones. Some would remember her as the instructor who'd tested them hardest. Others would remember her as the woman who'd proven through demonstration that assumptions about capability were just assumptions until performance provided evidence. All would remember that 8 weeks when their understanding of what flying meant was fundamentally reconstructed by someone who'd lived the reality they were only beginning to imagine. The miles accumulated, the darkness continued, and Kira Volkov, driving toward her next assignment, allowed herself a small smile at the thought of those cadets taking her lessons into operational environments, proving through their own performance that the Volkov protocol produced pilots who could handle the messy, unpredictable, terrifying reality of combat aviation. She'd never sought legacy, but perhaps that was the best kind, the kind that lived in others' capabilities rather than in plaques or commendations, the kind that measured success not in awards but in missions completed and lives saved, and pilots who came home because someone had cared enough to demand their best rather than accept their adequate. The highway carried her forward toward Norfolk, toward operational flying, toward whatever challenges waited in the darkness ahead. She'd face them the way she'd faced everything else, with competence, determination, and the absolute refusal to accept that assumptions about limitation defined actual capability. 8 years had proven that approach worked. 8 weeks had taught it to others. And whatever came next would continue the demonstration that excellence required only the courage to meet reality honestly, and the skill to adapt when reality proved more complicated than any training scenario could anticipate.